Hey everybody, today I'm going to be talking about Davey Wreden's 2015 game, The Beginner's Guide. This is Wreden's second creation after the more popular Stanley Parable. Basically, it centers on this character, Davey, who looks through the work of another game designer, Coda, and tries to figure out what sort of person he is by examining the games he makes.
And it kind of makes you wonder, what was going through his head as he was building this?
That's the spoiler-free version anyway, and I will be spoiling everything in this game from here on out, so if that's something that bothers you, get out while you can. So, why am I talking about this 2-year-old indie game? Well, the first reason is that it's good. I think it's really good and really interesting. The second reason is that it's super hard to talk about. Like, the whole thing is just meta and complicated, and I just find that stuff weirdly appealing. Before I break into the beginner's guide, though, it's important to establish how this video might deviate in some ways from a traditional video essay. See, when you're making an essay of any kind, you're generally supposed to start off with a thesis, go through a work looking for things that prove that thesis, and then at the end go, see, I'm right, look at all that proof. But this traditional format just doesn't really work with the beginner's guide. The game has a nasty habit of layering meaning on top of meaning and making things confusing. For that reason, I'm going to go through the game multiple times, looking at multiple ways we can understand it and what it's trying to say. One last disclaimer. For the sake of clarity, I'm going to call the Davey in the game Davey, and I'll call the Davey who designed the game Wreden. That should make things easier.
I find his games powerful and interesting, and I'd like this collection to reach him, to maybe encourage him to start creating again.
The first way I'm going to talk about the beginner's guide is going to give us a baseline for what the game is doing on a literal level. One of the first and most important readings we can get from this game is that it positions Davey as a bad guy. He's somebody who does immoral things, and perhaps more importantly, he's a terrible critic. At the start of the beginner's guide, Davey tells us that he's going to track Coda's work to uncover its real meaning.
I want us to see past the games themselves. I want to get to know who this human being really is. And that's exactly what we're going to do here.
But by the end, Davey admits that he changed Coda's games to fit a very specific narrative.
And to be fair, it's not like this is the first game that's needed some modification to be playable.
For instance, he adds lampposts to the end of various levels to give them a sense of closure and connective tissue. He also stole Coda's games, changed them, and showed them to his friends to get attention for himself.
I don't think I ever told you this, but when I took your work and I was showing it to people, it actually felt... it felt as though I were responsible for something important and valuable.
So, shitty stuff all in all. But once we have this fact about Davey in mind, that he did a really bad thing to Coda, we can see that this badness permeates the game. The audience is constantly reminded that Davey isn't actually working to understand Coda or what he's trying to do. Look at the second level, Whisper. Here the player encounters a maze, and Davey says this.
Apparently this space station has a labyrinth on it. Sure, I don't know. There's really no reason for it that I've ever been able to discern, so in the interest of time, I'm just gonna skip you on past it.
Notice how arrogantly he skips over this part of the level. He's not able to say what meaning the maze has, so it's eliminated from his analysis and from the player's experience. The game is rife with this sort of thing. Look at level 4. Here the player is presented with an open space to explore, and Davey says,
I know it's tempting, but there's actually nothing over here. Sorry.
But if the player doesn't follow instructions and does go to the boundary of the level, they'll hear an indecipherable noise. Davey doesn't want to think about this noise or what it could mean, so he tries his best to omit it. Or look here, in level 5. Coda designed the game so that at one point, the player would have to sit in a prison cell for an hour. But Davey just blows right past this without a second thought.
If you don't mind, I think we're gonna skip that.
Again, there's something in the game that Davey doesn't want to deal with, so he just pops it out of the experience. Davey isn't really concerned with what these games are doing, he's only concerned with connecting to the artist who made them. He doesn't care about what Coda's prison games mean thematically, he just thinks they represent a rut, and that makes him sad.
Personally, I think it's awful to watch this, to see a person basically unraveling through their work.
He doesn't care what this interesting conversation in Level 7 is trying to say. He just cares that now these games are supposedly working towards something tangible.
Because now he wants something to hold on to. He wants a reference point. He wants the work to be leading to something.
But as much as I think the literal read of this game is valuable, the beginner's guide gives us reason to think this understanding is incomplete. The reason I say that is that, on a literal level, some things that happen in the game just don't make sense. Look at the level House. Here, the player spends their time cleaning and talking to someone before they're thrown out of the level, and Davey later admits that he changed this game to give it this ending.
Like the house cleaning game. You know, that one used to actually loop the cleaning chores and you just cleaned a house forever. I had to cut it off so that you could exit the house and the game would actually end.
What's weird though is that when Davey talks about the house game, he says this.
Again, you can't stay in the dark space for too long. You just can't. You have to keep moving. It's how you stay alive. Which is the whole point of the puzzle doors, right? That sooner or later you have to pick up and move. I really thought that was the point of it.
But that doesn't make any sense. How could Davey possibly think the game had this very specific meaning when he changed it in the first place to give it that meaning? It's sort of implied that Davey wasn't aware of the changes he was making to these games. And that's just not a real thing that happens in the real world. Nobody meticulously combs through code making changes unintentionally. Because of this and things like this, it's important to move away from a totally literal reading of this game. So I'm going to go on to the second way we can understand the beginner's guide, as a metaphor for the relationship between critic and artist. The most obvious way we can start here is by seeing that this game is using Davey's story as a sort of cautionary tale about the pitfalls of bad criticism. The game seems to problematize Davey's entire approach to understanding art. At the very outset of the beginner's guide, Davey claims he likes these games because they give him some access to Coda's interiority, and the rest of the game works to question that idea, to undo the link between an artist and their art. Nowhere is this more clear than in the second to last chapter. After Davey spends the entire game speculating about how Coda felt when he was doing work, saying he was in slumps or depressed when he made various games, we see Coda's response. Struggling to come up with new ideas is not making me depressed. Low points are just part of the process. The fact that you think I am frustrated or broken says more about you than about me. Here, it doesn't seem like Wreden is just criticizing Davey. It seems like he's making a claim against reckless critics who project their own ideas onto art. That said, at times it feels like the game is doing more than showing some pitfalls in criticism. It feels like it presents broader statements against criticism in general. I mean, look at Coda's responses in The Tower again. In addition to the text blurbs I've shown you, he also writes, "At times I thought I was making these games for you." This statement suggests a certain disdain for critics, a rebellion against the idea that artists make their work for the purpose of scholarly investigation. And this level ends with the statement, "When you finally see what I'm talking about, don't say anything." You can read this a lot of ways, but I'm inclined to understand it as a gesture against criticism, a statement that sometimes what we gain from art can't and shouldn't be articulated. The thing is, once we see that the beginner's guide to some extent functions as a broad critique of criticism, a lot of the things that happen in the game seem to validate that position. So, earlier in the video, I made all these points about how awful Davey was because he skips over important sections and screws around with the games. And you can see how these behaviors can be connected metaphorically to any critical act. It's the critic's job to go through a work, pick out the parts of it they think are important, and make claims about the work based on those parts. More than that, works of criticism are inherently transformative. In the same way that Davey modifies Coda's games to make them fit his narrative, critics take apart and rearrange media in order to uncover the ideas it expresses. I mean, that's what I'm doing right now. I don't think that Wreden is trying to suggest that all acts of criticism are evil or something like that. Instead, I think he's pointing out that criticism always comes with a moral dimension. No critic is neutral or capable of finding the one objective set of meanings a work has. And because of that, they are always in the process of invading and transforming things that other people made. And that is a morally precarious role. Let's move on to my third and shortest way of understanding the beginner's guide, as a metaphor for the artistic process. What's interesting about this reading is that it's not strictly necessary. Everything that happens in the game can be understood as a discussion about the role of criticism. That said, there are certain aspects of the experience that make more sense when we look at it not as a conversation between critic and artist, but as a conversation between an artist and himself. For instance, there's a conflict in the game that develops early on. See, Coda doesn't make games to be playable or accessible. He makes them for himself, but Davey doesn't like that, and this is how he responds.
And I would always defend that, all this work goes into the game, why not make it playable and accessible?
So yeah, we can see this as a moment of critical weirdness on Davey's part, but we can read it just as easily as a conflict in the creative process. Coda is positioned as a figure of pure creative freedom, the part of the artist who only wants the work to be as interesting as possible. Davey, then, can be seen as the other side of the artist, the part that does want his work to be enjoyed by people. Look at the level Machine. Here, again, we're presented with two competing forms of the artist. There's the machine, who's conveniently named Coda and is the generator of games and creativity. And then there's the player character, who we can understand as Davey. It's his job to try to force the machine back into proper functioning, to make it accessible to this gang of reporters outside. The conflict between these two artistic forces reaches its head at the end of the beginner's guide, when the audience realizes that Davey stole Coda's games to show them to his friends.
So I started showing Coda's work to people. And the great part is that they really loved his games.
While Coda is happy to do work in isolation, Davey needs to put it on display.
It's strange, but the thought of not being driven by external validation is unthinkable.
Davey's not just a bad person, he's also a necessary figure in the production of art. After all, without him, without his ego and his desire to make games playable, we wouldn't be playing them. So we have these two sort of competing ways of understanding this game. On one hand, it's a metaphor for criticism. On the other, it's a metaphor for art production. So it's desirable to try to find a through line in this work, something that connects all its themes in one tidy little bundle. And that brings me to the fourth and final way we're going to look at this game, as a piece of art that's fixated on spaces and the boundaries between spaces. So, what do I mean by that? Well, to start off, Coda's games, that is, the games within the game, seem to emphasize this idea in a big way. In level 4, the player goes from an exterior space, the starting point, to an interior space.
A room that's warm and nice and filled with little ideas for games.
This is reversed in Chapter 5, where the player finds themselves in an interior space, but can press a button and become aware of a large exterior space. And when you go searching for this idea in Coda's games, you find it everywhere. In the name of being an un-Davey-like critic, I'm gonna go through a meticulous but probably still incomplete list of the places where the games emphasize spaces and boundaries. There's Chapter 7, Down, where the player character is supposed to spend an hour on the inside of a confining space, a prison. When they get out of that interior space, they go on to talk to a group of people who are also trapped, who are incapable of solving the puzzle that would allow them to exit. There's Chapter 9, Escape, where the player is put in different prison cells. Although they're given directions on how to escape this room, the level makes it impossible to exit. We're presented with spaces here, the inside and the outside of the prison cell, and we're shown an impenetrable boundary between the two. Moving on, we have Chapter 11, Lecture. Here, the player starts off in the shoes of a student listening to a motivational speaker, but in the middle of the game, we shift perspective and see the speaker's internal monologue. See how bigoted and strange he is. Again, we have boundaries pop up. We're reminded that our perspectives are fixed and that there's a wall between us and other people's thoughts. Following Lecture, there's Chapter 12, Theater. Here, the protagonist remembers a time they put themselves out there and tried to relate to someone else. In the end, though, this attempt fails, and the player regresses into an internal space, a prison cell of their own design. More than any specific level, this theme is present in some of the most important symbols of the beginner's guide. The maze, which is featured in 2 levels, is a good example. I mean, what's a maze besides an interior space that's hard to get out of? There's also an interesting puzzle that you can find in plenty of levels. It's a doorway that leads you from one space into another, but which also provides a space in and of itself, the room between the 2 doors. This quality of the doors is repeatedly posed as the most important thing about them. It's not so much the room you're in or the room you're entering, it's about the boundary between them and the meaning that holds.
And because there's this dark area between the doors, a space between spaces, before you move on, you get to pause. Just for a moment, a few seconds to reflect on and let go of the events that led you here.
Once you understand the beginner's guide as something deeply invested in spaces and boundaries, the rest of the game starts to come together. If you want to look at the game in a literal sense and pose Davey as a villain, then we can see his actions as the misguided attempt to break the boundary between himself and Coda. He wants to access someone else's mind through their work, but instead he hits a wall. If you want to look at the game as a metaphor for criticism, then we can see that the act of criticism comes with the desire to make external what is internal, to explain and clarify art by illuminating its themes. And if you want to look at the game as a metaphor for the creative process, then we can see how artists face a conflict of boundaries. On one hand, they have all these interesting ideas that they want to explore. On the other, they have to show these ideas to other people and make them interesting. By looking at the game as a meditation on boundary breaking and line crossing, it begins to feel holistic. Less like a set of conflicting ideas, more like a series of iterations on a central theme. You know, when I first played this game, I didn't know anything about it. My brother said it was good, so I tried it out, and I had no idea that Coda wasn't real or that Davey was supposed to be a bad guy. And I think it's a testament to the quality of this work that even as it has all these interlocking themes and all this complexity, it still works as a game. It's still fun to play without any further analysis. Despite the conflicting concepts the game presents, it feels cohesive and rich, and at every level, it's saying something that's worth saying. So that's all I had to say about the beginner's guide. Wow, this was pretty long. I didn't know it was going to be this long. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.